Hello, and welcome to this JAMA Clinical Reviews podcast. I'm Dr. Kirsten Bibbins-Domingo, and I'm the editor-in-chief of JAMA and the JAMA Network. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Aaron Kesselheim. He is professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and a faculty member in the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology and Pharmacoeconomics in the Department of Medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital. We're speaking about a special communications published in JAMA that Dr. Kesselheim authored with colleagues titled Federal Trade Commission Actions on Prescription Drugs, the year 2000 to 2022. Welcome, Dr. Kesselheim.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be able to be here.
Wonderful, wonderful. We're speaking today on a day when maybe a lot of physicians are thinking about the Federal Trade Commission because of a recent action that they took on the issue of non-compete clauses. But usually in the healthcare space, we're not talking about the Federal Trade Commission. Maybe some of our listeners might not be completely aware of why the Federal Trade Commission may have a role in the area of prescription drugs. So I'd love you to set the stage and tell us why you have devoted this article to the Federal Trade Commission.
Sure. So the Federal Trade Commission is a very important regulatory agency that exists within the executive branch in our federal government. And the Federal Trade Commission's really their key role is to oversee the market in the United States, the market for commercial goods. And healthcare goods is one of the major components of that. And the Federal Trade Commission oversees healthcare goods just as it does other consumer products. And what it does is it tries to ensure that there are no actions that inappropriately undermine competition in the market that can help lead to fair prices for products and can ensure that the products are available to people who need them. And so the Federal Trade Commission tries to oversee to ensure that manufacturers don't engage in unfair competition or deceptive acts or practices that would undermine competition and deceive consumers. So that's some of the main roles of Federal Trade Commission. And obviously, it's very important for those same principles to be applied to the healthcare market and in particular the pharmaceutical market, because the pharmaceutical market is such an important one for patients. And it is very important to ensure that the drugs are available and that there is adequate competition when that competition is supposed to exist to lower prices for patients so that they can benefit from that competition.
So that gets us to the rationale. Clearly, an arm of the executive branch that has power in an important sector. And you and your colleagues looked over a period of just over 22 years to identify the actions that the Federal Trade Commission had taken with regard to the pharmaceutical industry. So describe to me a little bit more about the research question you're interested in and how you approached it.
Sure. So most people think about oversight of the pharmaceutical industry with respect to the FDA and the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. But what we wanted to do was to examine the Federal Trade Commission's role in overseeing fair practices in the pharmaceutical industry, because we think that the Federal Trade Commission has a lot of authority in this area, and we wanted to see how that authority has been exerted and what effects it's had and how interventionist the Federal Trade Commission has been in the prescription drug market. That was why we chose to focus on the Federal Trade Commission. Also because in the last couple of years, the Federal Trade Commission has become increasingly active in a lot of different fields across the US, including the healthcare market. And so there's been a lot more attention in the news. And as you said at the very beginning, it's quite a coincidence that we're having this conversation the day after the Federal Trade Commission announced a very important new rule related to non-compete clauses that will affect many physicians and healthcare providers across the country. So that's just one example of how the Federal Trade Commission really can make major fundamental changes to the healthcare market if it wants to get involved. And so what we wanted to do was look at how the Federal Trade Commission has gotten involved in the prescription drug market over the last 20 years.
And what'd you find? You looked over the 22 years. Give me an idea of what you found.
We found that there have been about 100 or so, slightly less than 100 announced actions that the Federal Trade Commission has taken. And we found that in general, the actions taken have been relatively consistent over that period. There have not been spikes in activity. Most of those were enforcement actions intended to try to address particular anti-competitive conduct. and were actions intended to address potentially concerning mergers. Those two made up the majority of all the actions that we found. So we found that when the Federal Trade Commission does get involved in the pharmaceutical space, it is around addressing specific anti-competitive behavior and around addressing potentially concerning merger behavior.
You outline in this piece very nicely some of the specific cases, as well as the outcome of the FTC action. Some of these will be familiar to people who've been watching the news. Some of them are probably less familiar. Give us an example, though, of the nature of the action on the part of the pharmaceutical industry and then the FTC ruling.
Sure. So, for example, one of the more notorious cases that came up in the last couple years related to a pharmaceutical entrepreneur named Martin Shkreli, who acquired the rights to a very old anti-parasitic drug called pyrimethamine and raised the price hundreds of percent basically overnight. And he was able to do that because the product didn't have any other manufacturers making it. But what he also did at the same time was he undertook steps to undermine the ability of other manufacturers to then enter the market and to try to correct the price increases that he instituted. And so what he did was specifically he changed the distribution system of the drug so that you couldn't just get it at any pharmacy. You had to get it from one sole source pharmacy that he controlled. And by doing that was able to control the distribution of the product so that generic manufacturers may not be able to get supplies of it in order to do the tests that they would need to get FDA approval. So the FTC undertook action to prevent Shkreli from doing that and ended up winning the case to indicate that that behavior was improper and anti-competitive. And so that's an example of how the FTC can get involved to try to address an anti-competitive situation that has substantial potential harm for patients.
In many of the cases that you outline, the FTC ends up losing. So tell me a little bit about what we learned about that in terms of the role of this part of the executive branch in terms of taking these actions.
Sure, right. So I don't want to give the impression that every time the FTC gets involved, it wins. It has gotten involved in cases that it has not won. So, for example, one line of cases that the FTC got involved in were cases where brand name manufacturers, when faced with a challenge from a generic manufacturer for one of their patents, would pay the generic manufacturer to drop the challenge and to allow the brand name drug to stay on the market. And so the brand name drug would win by selling a drug at a very high price. The generic manufacturer would win by getting a direct payment from the brand name manufacturer, but the consumer would lose because the availability of generic competition helps lower prices and allows more patients to access drugs. So when the FTC challenged those kinds of agreements, the courts found that they were not anti-competitive and that they could be allowed. And so ultimately the FTC lost those cases and it ultimately went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found that, the FTC could review these kinds of cases, but they all are not necessarily anti-competitive. Some of those agreements between brand and generic manufacturers might be pro-competitive. And so the FTC kind of won a little bit and the companies kind of won a little bit. And now those kinds of agreements these days are subject to oversight, but aren't necessarily anti-competitive, which is what the FTC wanted. So again, the FTC has to enforce its authority within the bounds of the statute that it has. And, sometimes courts are not favorable to the FTC's interpretations.
But the court did rule that the FTC does have the ability to make a ruling in these cases.
Correct. The courts ended up ruling that the FTC has the ability to review the cases, but what the FTC had wanted was a bright line rule that said that those kinds of payments were not allowed, and the court said that that was going too far.
Yeah, very good. I understand. So the overview is quite comprehensive, and I would urge people who are interested in this topic to take a look because the tables are quite nice in terms of outlining the specific examples, both of the way in which the FTC can take an action and the specific types of cases as well as the outcomes. One of the points you make in the discussion is that there are more mechanisms, more ability for the FTC to take action in these types of cases. And maybe you could describe that a little bit more.
One of the things we were surprised about was we were surprised about how few FTC actions we found when we look back over the last 2 decades. I think maybe we expected to find that there were a lot more activity of the FTC. And we think that the 90-something actions that we found, given the size of the pharmaceutical market and the substantial amount of merger activity and other business practices that could arguably be considered to be anti-competitive going on in the pharmaceutical market, that number of actions was relatively small. And so when we talk about the need for Congress to ensure that the FTC has sufficient resources that it needs to take on potentially problematic business practices that make drugs inappropriately expensive for patients or that reduce the availability of drugs that patients need, or for Congress to give the FTC more authority to undertake investigations, and quite frankly, for the FTC to focus more on the pharmaceutical market because again, there is a lot of activity going on, and some of it might be problematic that the FTC just is prioritizing other fields to focus on because, again, unlike the FDA, the FTC has the entire consumer marketplace to take into account.
Just to be clear, though, the FTC has the authority. What you're calling on Congress to do is to perhaps resource or create other types of legislation to enable the FTC to focus more on the healthcare sector. Would that be fair? We're not talking about an expansion of its authority.
No, not necessarily expansion of its authority. I think that giving the FTC more resources to make sure that it is covering all the business practices that it is interested in, that would be one step. And then, of course, if there are specific practices that Congress becomes concerned about, they can pass legislation that focuses on those, or to be honest, they can write letters and call on the FTC to act in this area. So, for example, in recent years, there have been a number of senators that have written letters about their concern about excess patents that pharmaceutical companies receive and then list in the Orange Book that the FDA holds that prevent generic manufacturers from coming onto the market in a timely fashion. And just a couple months ago, the FTC responded to that by seeking the delisting of over 100 device patents on drug device combinations from the Orange Book. So that's another way that Congress can encourage the FDA to act on a particular business practice that is of potential concern because it makes it more difficult for patients to get the drugs they need.
The thing you are talking about, we've published on the pages of JAMA about these patent thickets, a way of multiple patents on multiple aspects of a particular device or way of delivering a medication that then prevent a generic product from entering the market. And so that's the specific aspect that you're talking about.
Exactly right. That's a very common business practice that pharmaceutical companies use to try to delay generic competition, is building these large thickets of patents around the active ingredient of a drug. And those patents might cover different formulations or uses of the drug, or might actually cover the device that is used to administer the drug, like the inhaler or the insulin pen. And so what I was talking about in delisting the patents from the Orange Book is that the FTC said that companies were listing patents on their drugs that didn't actually cover the drug at all, that it entirely just covered the delivery device for the product. And that would be improper to list with the FDA as covering the drug because it only covers the device. And so the FTC exercised its authority by requesting, in this case, that companies voluntarily delist these patents, or else threatening that they could follow up with an enforcement action. And in this case, I think a lot of companies took them seriously and have taken steps to do that. So that is another way that the FTC could exercise its authority in other areas, is by issuing letters or statements of concern about a particular practice.
There has been increased attention in Congress to the issues of the price of drugs, in the executive branch as well. We see the FTC taking more actions in the healthcare space. Are you optimistic, if you're reading the tea leaves, that there will be more in this space from the FTC?
I think so. I am optimistic. I think the FTC under the Biden administration has been very proactive in terms of trying to get a handle on problematic business practices. And in addition to some of the other steps that the Biden administration has taken around drug prices, I think all of those things together can really make a difference in terms of ensuring that patients are paying reasonable prices for drugs in the U.S., which is not something that has been historically very true.
Thank you very much to you and your colleagues for this very interesting work. It's work that I recommend others read because it helps shed light on an area that many may not know about, but is very important, obviously, for a sector that we care a lot about in healthcare, which is the availability of therapeutics for our patients. So, Dr. Kesselheim, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Actually, one thing just before I go, I wanted to acknowledge Joseph Duval, who is the lead author on this paper and really took the lead in compiling these cases, as well as my other co-authors, Alex Eagleman and Amit Sarpatwari. It's a great team that we had working on this, and we are grateful to be able to publish it in JAMA.
Wonderful. Thank you again. Have a wonderful day, and we look forward to more discussion on this topic. I'm Dr. Kirsten Bibbins-Domingo, Editor-in-Chief of JAMA and the JAMA Network, and this is the JAMA Clinical Reviews podcast. This episode was produced by Shelley Steffens at the JAMA Network. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com. Thanks for listening.